I didn't scream when she stole my life's work. I didn't flip the heavy oak conference table or point fingers like a betrayed martyr. I just sat there, listening to the rattle of the air conditioning vent, smelling stale, burnt coffee, watching a 23-year-old girl pitch my exact, unwritten ideas to the board. She knew every word I was going to say because she had lived this year before. She wanted my spotlight, so I let her have it. Then I walked out. The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and cheap cologne. The projector fan whined above us a high, anxious pitch that usually gave me a migraine by 3 o'clock. I was staring at the mole on the back of David's neck. He was nodding, enraptured. Everyone was. At the front of the room stood Rowan. She was 23, fresh out of some mid-tier liberal arts college, wearing a pale pink blazer that somehow didn't look ridiculous under the harsh fluorescent lights. The architecture of the Horizon build isn't just about streamlining the data pipeline, Rowan said. Her voice was smooth, confident. It's about predictive friction. We introduce microscopic delays in the free tier to subliminally push users toward the premium upgrade without triggering conscious frustration. I stopped breathing. My fingers hovering over the trackpad of my laptop turned to ice. I slowly looked down at the physical leather-bound notebook resting to the right of my keyboard. It was open to a page I had written at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago on my living room couch. My handwriting was a jagged, exhausted scrawl. Predictive friction, micro delays, free tier, to subliminal premium push. Avoid conscious frustration. I hadn't typed it into any cloud document. I hadn't spoken it aloud to a single soul. The only other living creature in the room when I coined that phrase was my cat. We call it symbiotic retention. Rowan continued, clicking to the next slide. My stomach plummeted, a violent drop that left acid burning in my throat. On the screen was a wireframe. It was a crude, digitized version of the exact sketch occupying the bottom half of my notebook page. I didn't yell. I didn't interrupt. I just sat there, the synthetic fabric of my office chair suddenly rough and suffocating against my back. I looked at Rowan. She was already looking at me. There was a micro-expression on her face, a fleeting, twitchy thing. It wasn't the innocent, eager-to-please smile of a junior dev trying to impress the senior lead. It was a look of profound, smug anticipation. She was waiting for me to snap. She was waiting for the senior designer, Naomi, to lose her mind, to slam her fists on the table and shout, "That's mine." Because if I did that, I would look insane. I had no proof. The timestamp on my physical notebook meant nothing. It hit me then, not like a bolt of lightning, but like a slow, dark stain seeping through the floorboards. The last 3 weeks. The impossible coincidences. Rowan sidestepping a spilled coffee in the break room, 2 seconds before Ben tripped and dropped it. Rowan casually suggesting we double-check the routing protocol on a Friday afternoon, exactly 2 hours before a catastrophic server crash would have wiped out a week of work. Rowan looking at me on a random Tuesday and saying, "Don't worry, your sister's flight landed safely," 10 minutes before my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. She knew the future. Whether she had died and come back or fallen through some rip in time, I didn't know and I didn't care. The mechanics of her rebirth were irrelevant. The reality was sitting right in front of me. Rowan had lived this timeline before. In her previous run, I had likely pitched this project, led it to a massive, multi-million-dollar success, and secured the VP spot. Now, She was front-running me. She was downloading my legacy from her memory and presenting it as her own. "This is phenomenal. Rowan," David said, his voice thick with corporate greed. He leaned back his chair, groaning under his weight. He turned to me. "Naomi, this is exactly the kind of out-of-the-box thinking we've been needing on the senior team. You've been managing Rowan, right? She's clearly learning a lot from you." A lump of bile sat hot and heavy in my chest. Learning from me? No, she was plundering me. I looked at Rowan again. Her hands were gripping the edges of the podium. Her knuckles were white. She was nervous. Why? Because she knew she was stealing, and she was bracing for the impact of my wrath. In her timeline, maybe this was the day I caught her sneaking into my files. Maybe this was the day we had a massive blowout. I felt a sudden bizarre detachment. My anger, which had flared hot enough to burn down the building seconds ago, just evaporated. It was replaced by a bone-deep, crushing exhaustion. I had spent 4 years at this company. 4 years of skipped lunches, graying hair, and grinding my teeth into flat nubs in my sleep. I had built the back end of our flagship software with my bare hands, dealing with David's incompetence and the agonizing, slow drip of corporate bureaucracy. The Horizon project was supposed to be my ticket out, my final masterpiece, before demanding a quiet, high-paying advisory role. And now this girl, with pristine cuticles and a stolen script, wanted the burden. I looked at the slide on the screen. The wireframe was there. The concept was there. But looking closely, I noticed what was missing. The how. Rowan had memorized the sales pitch. She remembered the broad strokes of my final presentation, but she hadn't memorized the 50,000 lines of spaghetti code, the agonizing API integrations, or the fragile Band-Aid fixes holding our legacy servers together. She knew what the house looked like from the street, but she didn't know the foundation was built on quicksand. "It's a solid vision," I said. My voice sounded flat dry. "Very ambitious, Rowan." Rowan blinked. The smugness fractured for a fraction of a second, replaced by confusion. "Thank you, Naomi," she said, her voice tight. I value your feedback." "No feedback," I said, closing my notebook with a soft thud. "I think you've got it all figured out." The meeting ended with a round of applause that sounded like wet meat slapping against a butcher's block. David practically threw his arm out, patting Rowan on the shoulder. I walked back to my desk. The open-plan office hummed with the sound of mechanical keyboards and muffled headset chatter. The air smelled of stale printer toner and someone's microwaved broccoli. I sat down. My monitor woke up displaying the sprawling, chaotic mess of my integrated development environment. Lines of code glowing green and blue against the dark background. It was beautiful in a sick, twisted way. It was mine. "Naomi." I didn't turn around right away. I let my fingers rest on the keys, feeling the smooth, worn plastic of the enter key. Then I swiveled my chair. Rowan was standing there. She looked different up close. The confidence from the boardroom was leaking out of her. She was chewing the inside of her cheek, a nervous habit I remembered she had when she first started. "Hey," she said, leaning against the edge of my cubicle partition. She was trying for casual, but her knuckles were white again as she gripped the gray fabric. "I hope you aren't mad about the pitch. I was up late and it all just poured out of me. I really wanted to take initiative." I stared at her. I looked at the slight tremor in her hands. I realized something profound. She was terrified of me. Even with her advantage, even knowing the future She was still a junior dev, standing in the shadow of the senior lead. She needed my validation. Or at least, she needed me to play the role she expected me to play. The angry, ousted mentor. "I'm not mad, Rowan," I said. It was the truest thing I had said all day. Her brow furrowed. "You're not." "No." I turned back to my screen. It was a good pitch. The board loved it. David loved it. "So, you'll help me build it?" The desperation in her voice was a microtone, barely there, but I heard it. "I mean, obviously you're the lead, so I'll need your sign-off on the repos, and we'll need to figure out how to integrate the legacy databases." She was fishing. She was throwing out buzzwords, hoping I would bite, hoping I would take the wheel, and let her ride shotgun while claiming she was driving. In her previous life, I had probably fought her tooth and nail, forced her to prove herself, and ultimately done the heavy lifting, because my pride wouldn't let the project fail. My pride, that was the flaw in her algorithm. She assumed I still cared. "Actually," I said, minimizing the code window and opening my email client, "I think you're ready to fly solo on this one." "What?" Rowan's voice went up an octave. "It's your vision," I said, mildly typing David's name into the "to" field. "You should own the execution. It wouldn't be fair for me to step in and muddy the waters with my old school methods." "But the back end," she stammered. I haven't looked at the core logic for the payment gateways yet." "You'll figure it out," I said. "You had a flash of inspiration, right? Trust your gut." I turned my back to her. I could hear her breathing, short, shallow intakes of air. She stood there for another 20 seconds before slowly walking away. Her footsteps were heavy on the cheap carpet. I looked at the blank email draft. "David, please accept this email as formal notice of my resignation effective immediately. I will leave my security badge and company laptop on my desk. My personal files have been cleared. I wish the team the best of luck with the Horizon project. Naomi." I didn't ask for a 2-week notice period. I didn't ask for an exit interview. I didn't draft a passive-aggressive sign-off to the team. I clicked send. The whoosh sound of the outgoing email felt physical, like a pressure valve releasing behind my eyes. I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out my canvas tote bag. I didn't have much. A ceramic mug my sister made me, a mechanical keyboard I brought from home, a framed photo of my cat, 3 bottles of aspirin. As I packed, a weird bubbling sensation started in my chest. It felt like a laugh, but my mouth was pressed in a tight, grim line. It was the absurdity of it all. Rowan had gone through the trouble of dying and coming back, or whatever cosmic joke had reset her timeline, just to steal a corporate tech project. She had cheated on the final exam by stealing the answers, not realizing the answers were to a different test. Horizon wasn't just a project. It was a ticking time bomb of technical debt. The only reason it functioned was because I spent 3 hours every morning manually resetting a corrupted data loop that David refused to let me formally rewrite because it would cost too much downtime. Rowan didn't know about the data loop. I had never documented it. It lived entirely in my head. I zipped my bag. I placed my security badge squarely in the center of my closed laptop. I stood up and walked out. I didn't look at Rowan's desk. I didn't look at David's glass office. I just walked to the elevator, pressed the down button, and waited. When the doors opened to the lobby, the smell of rain hit me. The glass doors were wet, the gray city sky pressing against the building. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped onto the wet asphalt. The cold air bit into my cheeks. For the first time in 4 years, my shoulders dropped. The persistent knot of tension at the base of my skull loosened. I took a deep breath of damp, smoggy city air, and it tasted sweeter than anything I'd ever known. Let her have it. Let her have the title, the praise, in the rapidly sinking ship. My apartment was too quiet. For the first 48 hours, the silence rang in my ears like tinnitus. I was so used to the constant ping of Slack messages, the vibration of my phone on the desk, the low hum of anxiety that dictated my waking hours. Now, there was just the hum of my refrigerator and the occasional passing siren outside my third-floor window. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting on my worn velvet sofa, wearing sweatpants I hadn't washed in a week, eating dry cereal out of a chipped mug. I was watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight, cutting through the blinds. My phone, sitting face down on the coffee table, began to vibrate. It made a harsh buzzing sound against the cheap wood veneer. Buzz, buzz. It stopped, then immediately started again. I chewed a mouthful of Oat Loops, swallowed dryly, and leaned forward to flip the phone over. 47 missed calls. 12 from David, 8 from HR, and 27 from a number I hadn't saved, but knew implicitly. Rowan. I watched the screen light up with her number again. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt a dull, heavy amusement. In my mind's eye, I could see the office perfectly. It was Tuesday. Tuesdays at 2 p.m. were when the automated cron jobs ran the database synchronization. The same synchronization that relied on my manual, undocumented override to prevent the legacy system from throwing a fatal memory error. If nobody had done the override, the servers were currently melting down. The client portals would be throwing 502 bad gateway errors. David would be sweating through his shirt, screaming at anyone in earshot. And Rowan would be staring at a terminal window, filled with red text, realizing that knowing the future didn't mean understanding the present. The phone stopped ringing. A notification popped up. New voicemail. I tapped the screen, the glass cool under my finger. I put the phone on speaker and set it back on the table. Static. Then a sharp intake of breath. Naomi, Naomi, please pick up. Rowan's voice was unrecognizable. The smooth, confident pitch deck voice was gone. This voice was reedy tight and frayed at the edges. She sounded like she had been crying, or was right on the verge of it. I know you're angry. I know I overstepped. David said you quit, but he thinks you're just negotiating. He told me to call you and tell you he'll match whatever offer you got. Please. There was a pause. I could hear the background noise, the chaotic murmur of an office in full panic mode, a faint shout that sounded exactly like David yelling, "What do you mean the backups are corrupted? Naomi?" The sync failed. Rowan whispered into the phone, her voice dropping as if she were hiding in a bathroom stall. The Horizon integration module is throwing a recursive loop error. I tried rolling back the commit, but it's cascading into the billing tables. The users. We're double billing the premium users. Naomi. I don't know how to stop it. I looked at your documentation, but it's not there. The fix isn't there. A harsh, ragged sob broke through her sentence. You're supposed to be here, she hissed, the desperation giving way to an irrational, childish anger. Before. You never quit. You were supposed to yell at me, and then you were supposed to fix it. Why did you leave? You can't just leave. Please, call me back. I don't know what to do. The voicemail beeped and cut off. Silence rushed back into the apartment. I sat back against the cushions. You're supposed to be here, That was the crux of it, wasn't it? She hadn't just stolen my ideas. She had relied on my presence to validate her theft. She wanted to play the brilliant upstart who overthrew the bitter veteran. She wanted the drama, the victory, the satisfying narrative arc of a reborn protagonist. But I wasn't an NPC in her little revenge fantasy. I was a tired, underpaid engineer who had found an exit door and walked through it. I picked up the phone. I didn't call her back. Instead, I opened my browser and navigated to the company's public-facing status page. It was a sea of red. Payment gateway, critical outage, user authentication degraded performance, database sync offline. I watched the red error icons pulse on the screen. It was catastrophic. Millions of dollars in transactions stalled. Client trust evaporating by the second. The Horizon project dead on arrival. Rowan had wanted the keys to the kingdom. She just hadn't realized the castle was currently on fire, and I was the only one who knew where the fire extinguishers were buried. I locked my phone, tossed it onto the cushion beside me, and stood up. The apartment was a mess. There were empty takeout containers on the counter, and my plants were looking a little wilted. I stretched my back, popping in satisfying succession. I walked over to the window, opened the blinds fully, and let the afternoon light pour in. I needed to water the ferns, maybe take a walk to that bakery down the street I never had time to visit. Let the servers burn. I was finally off the clock. Quitting a job you hate isn't a cinematic explosion. It's a slow, physical detox. For the first 4 days, my body betrayed me. I woke up at 5:45 a.m., my heart slamming against my ribs, adrenaline pumping through my veins in anticipation of the morning stand-up meeting. My hand would blindly grab for my phone on the nightstand to check for server outage alerts. When my fingers found empty wood, a sharp spike of panic would hit my throat, followed seconds later by a confusing, heavy wave of relief. It felt like phantom limb syndrome. My brain was still trying to flex muscles that were no longer attached to my life. By Thursday, the company had stopped calling my phone. They had moved on to email. My personal inbox was clogged with increasingly unhinged subject lines from David HR and our legal department. Subject urgent, severance negotiation. Subject immediate attention. Required, regarding Horizon. IP. Subject, Naomi. Please just call me back. I didn't open them. I marked them all as read. I spent Thursday afternoon deep cleaning the grout in my bathroom with a toothbrush, savoring the harsh chemical smell of bleach. It was a problem I could fix with physical labor. You scrub, the mold goes away. Code never worked like that. Code was a living, breathing fungus that mutated the moment you turned your back on it. Friday morning, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, aggressive buzz that rattled the cheap plastic casing on the wall. I was wearing an oversized gray sweater and mismatched socks, holding a half-eaten piece of toast. I looked through the peephole. It was David. He looked entirely out of place in my dingy, narrow hallway, with its peeling floral wallpaper. He was wearing his standard $2,000 navy suit, but the collar was unbuttoned, his tie was loose, and he was sweating. The hallway smelled faintly of my neighbor's boiled cabbage, and David looked like he was trying very hard not to breathe it in. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain engaged. Naomi. He breathed his eyes wide. He looked 10 years older than he had on Monday. There were deep purple bags under his eyes. Thank God. You have the wrong address, David. I said, my voice thick from not speaking to anyone for days. My employment file clearly stated my mailing address was a P.O. box. I pulled your emergency contact file from HR, he said, shifting his weight. His leather Oxfords squeaked against the linoleum. Naomi, please. Let me in. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about. I resigned. You didn't resign. You abandoned a critical infrastructure project during a live deployment phase. He snapped a flash of his usual bullying tone, bleeding through the desperation. You know what that looks like to the board? I took a bite of my toast. The crunch sounded incredibly loud in the quiet hallway. It looks like your new senior lead couldn't handle the deployment phase. David's face flushed a deep, ugly mottled red. He rubbed a hand over his face, smearing a sheen of grease across his forehead. Rowan she's inexperienced. We promoted her too fast. I admit that. The pitch was brilliant, but the execution is a disaster. She broke the legacy database, Naomi. She ran a script that corrupted the primary keys on the billing tables. I stopped chewing. A script. She ran a script. I knew exactly what script she had run. It was a cleanup tool I had written to prune dead accounts, but it was incredibly unstable. It required a manual bypass on the secondary server to prevent it from indexing the active ledger. I had never documented the bypass because David had ordered me to stop wasting time on maintenance and focus on new features. Rowan, in her infinite future-knowing wisdom, remembered the tool existed. She probably thought running it would make her look like a proactive genius. She didn't know the gun was loaded with a reversed barrel. She wiped the active ledger. I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Not out of sympathy, but out of sheer, visceral horror as an engineer. 4 years of data. It's a mess, David pleaded, sensing a crack in my armor. We have clients threatening lawsuits. The payment gateway has been offline for 72 hours. We're bleeding hundreds of thousands a day. Naomi, I will double your salary. Backdated to Monday. I'll fire Rowan right now while I'm standing on your doorstep. Just come back and run the rollback. I looked at him. The smell of his expensive, spicy cologne was fighting a losing battle against the stale hallway air. He wasn't apologizing. He was trying to buy a fire extinguisher. There is no rollback, David, I said softly. He froze. What? The secondary server wasn't provisioned with enough storage for a full snapshot. I told you that in February. You said it wasn't in the Q1 budget. I watched his face fall, the blood draining away, leaving him looking gray and sick. If she corrupted the primary keys on the live tables, the data is gone. You're going to have to manually reconcile the accounts against the bank statements. That will take months, he whispered. It sounds like a great learning opportunity for Rowan, I said. I didn't wait for him to respond. I shut the door, the heavy wood clicking solidly into the frame. I slid the deadbolt home. I stood in the entryway for a long time, listening to his heavy, defeated breathing on the other side of the door. Finally, I heard his leather shoes squeak as he turned and walked away. I looked down at the half-eaten toast in my hand. I wasn't hungry anymore. I walked into the kitchen and dropped it into the trash can. My code. My terrible, messy, held together with spit and wire code. She had killed it in 3 days. I felt a weird, heavy morning. It was a toxic relationship, but it had been mine. The tech industry is a small, incestuous village that loves nothing more than a public execution. By week 2, the collapse of the Horizon project wasn't just an internal panic. It was industry gossip. I sat on my sofa with my laptop, a cup of green tea growing cold on the table, reading an article on a mid-tier tech blog. Disaster Deployment: How Tech Startup Aura Burned Its Own Bridge. The article was brutal. It didn't name Rowan, referring to her only as an underqualified junior developer pushed into a leadership vacuum. But it named the company. It detailed the offline payment gateways, the lost data, and the rumors of an SEC investigation regarding the mishandling of user financial data. My phone buzzed against the cushion. It was Ben. Ben was the front-end guy, the one who almost spilled the coffee. We weren't friends exactly. We were trench buddies. We communicated entirely in sarcastic Slack emojis and mutual exhaustion. I picked it up. "Hello. Tell me you got out with a massive severance," Ben said. His voice was a raspy croak. I could hear the rhythmic clacking of a mechanical keyboard in the background. "I quit without notice," I said, leaning back against the couch. "Why, how bad is the smell in the trenches?" Ben let out a hollow, humorless laugh that devolved into a cough. "It smells like burning plastic and ruined careers, Naomi. It's a bloodbath." "David came to my apartment last week," I admitted. "I know. He told everyone you were holding out for equity and trying to blackmail the company." Ben sighed, a heavy dragging sound. "Half the engineering team quit on Monday. HR is bringing in temps, but nobody can read the legacy codebase. We're flying blind." And Rowan, the name, tasted sour in my mouth. A long silence stretched over the line. "She's losing her mind, Naomi," Ben said quietly. The sarcasm was gone from his voice, replaced by a genuine, unsettling discomfort. "I mean it. It's getting weird. Weird how she keeps talking to herself, but not like muttering code logic. She keeps saying things like, 'This isn't how it happened,' and 'The logs were supposed to be here.' She tore my desk apart, looking for a physical notebook. She kept screaming that I had stolen it, that there was a notebook with all the answers." My eyes flicked to the coffee table, where my worn, leather-bound notebook sat serving as a coaster for my cold tea. "She's not sleeping." Ben continued the clacking of his keyboard, finally stopping. "She wears the same clothes for days. David pulled her into his office yesterday and just screamed at her for an hour. I heard him through the glass. He told her she was a fraud. She didn't even cry. She just sat there staring at the wall, whispering that the timeline was broken. A shiver, entirely unbidden, ran down my spine. The hair on my arms stood up. "She thinks she's a prophet who lost her God," I murmured. "What?" Ben asked. "Nothing." I rubbed my temples, feeling a dull ache building behind my eyes. "Ben, you need to get out. The company is going to file for Chapter 11 by the end of the month. Don't go down with the ship." "I'm interviewing at 2 places tomorrow," he said, sounding exhausted. I had to call you. I had to know you didn't actually sabotage the servers before you left. Rowan keeps telling everyone you planted a logic bomb to ruin her life." The sheer audacity of it made me laugh. A dry, scraping sound in my throat. "I didn't need to plant a bomb, Ben. The system was a bomb. I was just the idiot holding down the trigger so it wouldn't explode. When I let go, well, you see what happened?" "Yeah," Ben said softly. "I see it. Stay safe, Naomi." He hung up. I set the phone down. The apartment felt too quiet again, but this time it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of waiting for a storm to finally break overhead. Rowan wasn't just failing. She was psychologically breaking under the weight of a reality she thought she controlled. She had treated life like a video game, where she had already read the walkthrough. But she forgot that the walkthrough only works if you actually press the buttons yourself. She had memorized my victory, but she had never felt the agonizing burn of the work it took to get there. Now she was trapped in a timeline where the code was foreign, The data was dead, and the original author was gone. I looked at the window. The sky over the city was a bruised, heavy purple. It was going to rain. I didn't expect to see her. If this were a movie, our final confrontation would have happened in the rain, screaming at each other across the hood of a car or in a sterile glass-walled boardroom. Instead, it happened on a Tuesday evening in the bread aisle of the generic supermarket, 3 blocks from my apartment. I was wearing yoga pants and an oversized fleece, holding a loaf of sourdough, and debating whether I wanted to spend $6 on a jar of imported jam. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead a low, annoying frequency. The air smelled of cardboard boxes and the faint, sweet scent of floor wax. You changed the variable. The voice was thin, raspy, and devoid of moisture. It sounded like dried leaves scraping across concrete. I froze the loaf of sourdough halfway to my basket. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I turned slowly. Rowan stood at the end of the aisle by the discounted bagels. I barely recognized her. The 23-year-old girl with the perfect blowout and the pale pink blazer was gone. This Rowan looked skeletal. Her skin was a sallow grayish yellow under the harsh store lights. Her hair was pulled back into a greasy, uneven knot, and she was wearing a massive stained hoodie that looked like it belonged to someone twice her size. Her eyes were the worst part. They were bloodshot, the pupils blown wide and manic. She looked like an addict coming down off a terrifying high. I didn't drop my bread. I didn't gasp. I just looked at her, feeling a profound, heavy sadness mixed with absolute disgust. "Rowan," I said, my voice flat. "You shouldn't be here." She took a step closer. Her sneakers scuffed loudly on the linoleum. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her hoodie, but I could see her arms trembling beneath the fabric. "You changed it," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch, a desperate whining frequency. "You weren't supposed to quit. You were supposed to fight me. You were supposed to stay and fix the legacy pipeline while I handled the executive meetings. That's what happened." She stopped swaying slightly on her feet. She looked around the empty bread aisle, her eyes darting frantically, as if expecting David or the board of directors to jump out from behind the hamburger buns. "That's what happened before," she whispered, her voice cracking. I placed the sourdough in my basket. The crinkle of the plastic wrapper felt immensely loud. I turned to fully face her. "Before," I said calmly. I didn't frame it as a question. I didn't ask her if she was crazy. I just met her on her own deranged playing field. She flinched as if I had struck her. A ragged sob tore out of her throat. "I died, Naomi." She wept, the tears spilling over her dark, bruised under eyes. "I got hit by a car on 4th Street. I woke up and it was a year ago. I had a second chance. I knew everything. I knew the Horizon Project was going to make you VP. I knew the exact pitch you used to win over the board. I just wanted to be someone. I wanted to be important." She took her hands out of her pockets. Her fingernails were chewed down to bleeding nubs. She reached out toward me, her fingers curling into claws. "But you ruined it," she snarled, the sorrow instantly turning into a brittle, terrifying rage. "You broke the timeline. You quit. The servers crashed, and the data is gone, and David is firing me, and I don't know how to fix it. You stole my second chance." I looked at her trembling hands. I didn't step back. I just stood my ground, feeling the cold air from the dairy aisle seeping into my bones. "I didn't steal anything from you, Rowan," I said, my voice low and hard. You stole from a ghost." She blinked, confused. "What?" "You memorized a speech," I said, taking a slow step toward her. I wanted her to hear every word. I wanted it to sink into whatever fractured logic was keeping her upright. "You memorized the finish line, but you didn't walk the marathon. You didn't spend 3 years fighting with the architecture. You didn't learn the exact broken rhythm of those servers. You didn't know that the system was a house of cards, and I was the only one holding my breath so it wouldn't fall." "I knew the code," she protested weakly, shrinking back from me. "You knew the syntax," I corrected mercilessly. "You didn't know the context. Knowing the future doesn't make you smart, Rowan. It just makes you a cheat. And cheating only works if the test stays exactly the same." I looked at her, standing there among the discounted bread, a pathetic broken thief who had stolen a crown too heavy for her neck. "You thought my life was easy because you saw the reward," I said, the lingering bitterness finally bleeding out of me, leaving nothing but cold, hard reality. "You wanted my success, but you didn't want my ulcers, my anxiety, or the 50-hour work weeks holding a dying server together with duct tape. You took the job. You own the failure." I turned my back on her. I picked up my basket, the plastic handle digging into my palm. "Naomi, wait." She screamed a shrill tearing sound that echoed through the empty grocery store. I heard the scuff of her shoes as she lunged forward. "Please, tell me how to rebuild the database. Just tell me the logic loop. I can fix it. If you just tell me." I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. "Figure it out, Rowan," I called over my shoulder, my voice echoing off the high metal ceiling. "You've got the rest of your life." I walked down the aisle, turned the corner, past the frozen vegetables, and headed for the checkout. Behind me, I heard the dull, heavy thud of someone collapsing to their knees on the linoleum, followed by a low, rhythmic sobbing that sounded entirely, utterly hopeless. I paid for my groceries. I walked out into the cool night air. The city smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. It smelled like reality. I took a deep breath, shifted the paper bag in my arms, and started walking home. I had a loaf of sourdough to eat, and for the first time in years, a full, uninterrupted night of sleep waiting for me. Revenge doesn't pay the gas bill. In the movies, the protagonist walks away from the explosion without looking back, and the screen cuts to black. They never show the part where the protagonist has to wake up the next morning, make instant coffee because the good beans ran out, and stare at a dwindling checking account balance. The grocery store encounter left a bizarre metallic taste in my mouth for days. It was the taste of finality mixed with a sickening dose of pity. Rowan wasn't a mastermind. She was a kid who found a loaded gun, pointed it at her own foot, and pulled the trigger because she thought the safety was on. But my pity didn't change my reality. I was 31, unemployed, in an oversaturated market, with a resume that ended in a catastrophic, highly publicized corporate failure. The decompression sickness hit me in the 3rd week. The initial euphoria of sleeping past 6 a.m. evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, low-frequency anxiety that settled right behind my ribs. I spent my days sitting at a small laminate table by my window, the rhythmic patter of autumn rain against the glass serving as the soundtrack to my job hunt. I applied to 42 positions. I rewrote my cover letter until the words lost all meaning, turning into a soup of corporate buzzwords: synergy, agile deployment, cross-functional leadership. It felt like lying. It felt like putting on the same stifling suit I had just stripped off. My first interview was on a Tuesday morning. The company was a mid-sized fintech firm, housed in a glass and steel monolith downtown. The lobby smelled aggressively of ozone and white lilies. My heels clicked too loudly on the polished marble floor. I wore a charcoal blazer that felt stiff and foreign against my shoulders, the synthetic lining making me sweat before I even reached the elevator. The interview panel consisted of 3 men whose combined age probably equaled mine. They had aggressive haircuts and wore expensive minimalist watches. So Naomi, the one in the middle, said, steepling his fingers. He had a sharp, predatory smile. Your tenure at Aura ended abruptly, right around the time the Horizon deployment crashed the primary servers. Can you walk us through your role in that transition? They were circling the blood in the water. They wanted to know if I was the arsonist or the whistleblower. I looked at the grain of the conference table. I felt the old, familiar knot of tension tightening at the base of my skull. I could have lied. I could have spun a narrative about differing creative visions. I could have blamed David. I could have blamed the junior developer who thought she was a time-traveling god. Instead, I took a slow breath. The air in the room was overly conditioned dry and entirely devoid of life. Aura relied on a legacy database architecture that was fundamentally incompatible with the Horizon integration, I said. My voice was steady, flat, devoid of the defensive edge I used to carry. I advocated for a full refactoring of the backend over a 6-month timeline. Leadership demanded a live deployment in 3 weeks. When it became clear that my technical assessment was being ignored in favor of an impossible launch date, I tendered my resignation. I didn't mention Rowan. She wasn't the disease. She was just the opportunistic infection that killed the host. You walked away from a critical failure. The guy on the left asked, his brow furrowing. He was looking for a hero. He was looking for someone who would bleed for the company. I walked away from a failure I wasn't allowed to prevent. I corrected him. I met his gaze. I didn't blink. I write code. I build stable systems. I don't perform miracles on failing infrastructure to satisfy a marketing deadline. If you're looking for someone to hold a sinking ship together with their bare hands, I am not your candidate. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the smartboard monitor behind them. I didn't get the job. I didn't care. Walking out of that glass building, feeling the cold, damp city wind hit my face, I realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. The desperation to prove myself, the deep-seated need to be the smartest person in the room, the martyr complex that had kept me chained to Aura's dying servers. It was gone, burnt out. 2 weeks later, the news officially broke. Aura filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I read the article on my phone while standing in line at a bodega, waiting to buy milk and cheap laundry detergent. The smell of overripe bananas and dusty floor mats filled my nose. The article was clinical. It cited insurmountable technical debt, catastrophic data loss, and a failure to secure second-round venture funding following the Horizon launch disaster. David was mentioned by name, currently facing a class action lawsuit from the premium subscribers, whose billing data had been compromised. Rowan's name wasn't anywhere. She had been erased. The industry had chewed her up, swallowed her stolen ambition, and spat her out without even a footnote. I paid for my milk. The clerk, an older man with tired eyes, handed me my change. The coins were warm and heavy in my palm. Miserable weather, he muttered, nodding toward the gray street outside. It's just rain, I said, and for the first time in a very long time, I actually meant it. It took 3 months to find a job that didn't make my skin crawl. It wasn't a flashy startup. It wasn't a company trying to disrupt anything. It was a regional freight and logistics company located in a low-slung, ugly brick building next to an active rail yard. My desk was made of cheap composite wood that chipped at the edges. The chair squeaked when I leaned back. The office constantly smelled of diesel exhaust, stale Folgers coffee, and wet cardboard. It was paradise. The tech stack was 10 years old, a bulky monolithic beast of a system that tracked shipping containers across the Midwest. It wasn't sexy. It didn't use predictive AI or micro delays to psychologically manipulate users. It just told truckers where to put the heavy boxes. My manager was a woman named Sarah. She was 55, wore sensible shoes, and actually logged off at 5 p.m. During my interview, she had looked at my resume, sighed, and said, "We don't do sprints here, Naomi. We do marathons. If the servers go down, a truck full of frozen chicken goes bad in Toledo. Fix the bugs, document your code, and go home to your family." I took a 30% pay cut to work there. I had never been happier. One Thursday evening in late November, the air biting and smelling of impending snow, I met Ben for a drink. We met at a dive bar, halfway between my new office and his new gig at an established e-commerce brand. The bar was dark. The floor was perpetually sticky with spilled beer, and it smelled of yeast, old leather booths, and decades of bad decisions. Ben looked better. The bruised exhaustion that used to live under his eyes had faded. He had put on a few pounds. He ordered a dark stout and slid into the vinyl booth across from me. "Look at you," he said, raising his glass. "No stress fractures, no visible eye twitches. The freight business agrees with you." I spent 4 hours today optimizing a routing algorithm for a fleet of refrigerated trucks in Ohio. I said, peeling the wet label off my beer bottle. The condensation made my fingers numb. It was the most boring, satisfying code I've written in 5 years. Nobody screamed. Nobody threatened to fire me. Ben laughed, a rich, real sound that I hadn't heard from him during our entire tenure at Aura. We drank in comfortable silence. For a few minutes, the low hum of the jukebox playing something twangy and sad in the corner. "So," Ben finally said, tracing a circle in the condensation on the wooden table, "do you want the final autopsy report, or are we leaving the corpses buried?" I took a slow sip of my beer. The bitter, hoppy taste coated my tongue. I thought about Rowan crying in the bread aisle. I thought about David's red, sweating face at my apartment door. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive glee. I just felt a heavy, dull curiosity, like slowing down to look at a car crash on the highway. "Tell me," I said. Ben leaned in. "David is done. The investors sued him personally for gross negligence. They pulled his emails. They found out he had actively suppressed your warnings about the server infrastructure to push the launch. He's barred from acting as an executive in the tech sector for 5 years, and the legal fees are bankrupting him." I nodded. It was exactly what David deserved. He had built his entire career on exploiting the panic of people smarter than him. When he finally ran out of human shields, the math caught up with him. "And Rowan?" I asked softly. Ben's expression darkened. The easy camaraderie of the bar faded, replaced by a grim, uncomfortable shadow. "That's the ugly part," he said, keeping his voice low. "After the bankruptcy, she completely cracked. HR had to call her parents to come collect her from the office. She was sitting under her desk, ripping pages out of a notebook and eating them. She kept telling the paramedics that she needed to Reset the save file. A cold shiver raced down my spine, settling in the base of my tailbone. She went back to her hometown in upstate New York. Ben continued taking a heavy swallow of his stout. A buddy of mine knows her older brother. She's in an outpatient psychiatric facility. She won't touch a computer. She screams if someone hands her a smartphone. She thinks any digital device is a terminal that connects back to the timeline she broke. I looked down at my hands. My cuticles were dry, but they weren't chewed raw anymore. My fingernails were trimmed and clean. She had a second chance, I murmured, almost to myself. She came back. She had a whole lifetime of knowledge. And she destroyed herself in 3 weeks. She didn't have knowledge, Naomi. Ben corrected me gently. She had a cheat sheet. But a cheat sheet doesn't teach you how to think. It just teaches you how to mimic. When the variables changed, when you walked out, she didn't know how to adapt. She didn't know how to be an engineer. She only knew how to be a thief. He was right. In all those web novels and comics about rebirth, the protagonist always wins because they know the stock market trends or the winning lottery numbers or the secret weakness of their enemies. But real life isn't a sequence of fixed events. It's a chaotic breathing ecosystem of human reactions. Rowan knew the destination. She didn't understand the friction required to get there. By stealing my ideas, she bypassed the struggle. But the struggle was the only thing that built the muscle required to carry the weight of the success. "Do you feel guilty?" Ben asked, watching me closely. I thought about it. I searched my chest for the familiar gnawing ache of Catholic guilt that usually governed my life. I looked for the remorse of abandoning my team. I found nothing, just a quiet, empty space where my anxiety used to live. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I don't. I built a system." She stole the keys and drove it off a cliff. "I'm just glad I wasn't in the passenger seat." Ben smiled a small, sad curve of his lips. "Good. You shouldn't. You survived, Naomi. That's more than most of us did." We ordered another round. We didn't talk about Aura anymore. We talked about Ben's new dog, a goofy golden retriever mix. We talked about my quest to find a halfway decent bagel in my neighborhood. We talked about normal, boring, beautiful things. When I left the bar, it was snowing. Tiny, sharp flakes of ice stinging my cheeks and melting against my eyelashes. The city felt muffled, quiet, and infinitely large. I didn't have a multi-million-dollar buyout. I didn't have a title with a C or a V in front of it. I was a mid-level engineer at a freight company. But as I walked toward the subway, my breath pluming white in the freezing air, I realized my shoulders were entirely relaxed. I wasn't carrying anyone else's future anymore. I barely knew my own, and that was perfectly fine. 14 months, exactly 426 days, since I left my plastic security badge sitting on a closed laptop and walked out into the rain. It was a Saturday morning in late February. The sun was a pale, watery smudge, fighting its way through a bruised winter sky, offering light, but absolutely zero heat. I was out in the detached garage, behind my apartment building. My landlord, a perpetually sour man named Miller, who smoked cheap cigars and appreciated quiet tenants, let me rent it out for an extra $50 a month. The space smelled heavily of sawdust, dried oil stains on cracked concrete, and the sharp chemical tang of wood glue. I was wearing a thick flannel shirt, covered in fine yellow dust, my hair tied back in a messy, uneven knot, a carpenter's pencil tucked behind my ear. My hands were rough. The skin on my palms was beginning to form thick, yellowed calluses From months of gripping sandpaper-heavy clamps and chisels, there was a thin, angry, red scratch across my left knuckle where a screwdriver had slipped 2 days ago. I was building a bookshelf. It wasn't a complex piece of engineering, and I was by no means a master carpenter. It was just pine screws and gravity, but it required a fundamentally different kind of focus than writing code. When a server throws a critical error, the problem is invisible. It's a logic puzzle buried deep inside a silicon chip, floating in a cloud server thousands of miles away. You can't touch a memory leak. You can't smell a corrupted database. You can only perceive it through the frantic blinking of a cursor on a sterile screen. But when you cut a piece of wood a 1/4 inch too short, the failure is physical. You feel the mistake in the resistance of the saw. You see the ugly, gaping gap when you try to fit the joint. You have to physically acknowledge your own flaw, and you either find a way to work around it, or you throw the ruined piece into the scrap pile and start completely over. There is no Control-Z in woodworking. There is no server rollback to a previous uncorrupted save state. There is only the harsh tactile reality of what you have built with your own 2 hands. I ran my bare palm over the edge of the middle shelf, feeling the smooth, sanded grain of the pine. The friction warmed my cold skin. It was deeply, viscerally satisfying. It was proof of existence. I had taken up physical space today. I had manipulated matter. On the workbench beside my drill, my phone vibrated. The harsh, mechanical bzzzt against the wood sounded violent in the quiet garage. I stopped rubbing the wood. I wiped the sawdust off my hands onto my heavy denim jeans, leaving twin pale streaks on my thighs, and picked up the device. It was an email notification, my personal inbox. I tapped the screen, the glass feeling unnaturally smooth after the texture of the pine. The sender was an unfamiliar address, just a random string of alphanumeric characters. A burner account. The subject line was entirely blank. I frowned my thumb, hovering over the delete icon, assuming it was a phishing scam. But an odd, heavy intuition made me click the body of the email instead. There was no greeting. There was no signature. There was only a single sentence floating in the stark white space of the screen. Does it ever stop feeling like you're living in the wrong draft? I stopped breathing. The air in the garage suddenly felt 10 degrees colder, biting through the flannel of my shirt. I knew exactly who it was. She didn't need to sign her name. Rowan, somewhere in upstate New York, sitting in a quiet room, stripped of sharp edges and fast internet, she had managed to find a device. She had managed to remember my email address through the fog of whatever medication they had her on. And she was reaching out across the void, still trapped in the agonizing purgatory of a timeline she had shattered. Does it ever stop feeling like you're living in the wrong draft? It was a devastating question. It was the question of a girl who had fundamentally misunderstood how reality functioned. She had treated life like a Google Doc. She believed it could be edited, optimized, and perfected by simply copy-pasting someone else's success over her own blank page. She thought she had found a glitch in the universe, a way to skip the agonizing, messy chapters of a story and jump straight to the satisfying conclusion. She believed there was a right draft, a perfect, pristine timeline where she was brilliant, rich, respected, and adored. She didn't understand that every draft is rough. Every timeline is messy, filled with corrupted data, terrible decisions, and painful, grinding friction. For a terrifying, ugly second, A spike of pure, vindictive satisfaction flared in my chest. A dark, cynical part of my brain smiled. Good, I thought. I hope the wrong draft is suffocating you. I hope you feel the ghost of the timeline you killed every time you close your eyes. It was a cruel, petty thought. I didn't try to suppress it. I let it wash over me, acknowledging the bitterness I still carried. I wasn't a saint. I had been robbed, and watching the thief choke on the stolen goods felt undeniably sweet. But the sweetness faded quickly, leaving a sour metallic taste in the back of my throat. I looked at my thumb, holding the edge of the phone. The fresh cut near the knuckle throbbed a dull, rhythmic beat in time with my pulse. It was inflamed. It was real. I drafted a dozen replies in my head. I could destroy her. I could type out exactly how pathetic she was twisting the knife until she broke completely. I could tell her that the timeline wasn't broken. She was just incompetent. Or I could be the benevolent mentor. I could tell her the truth, that there is no master copy of reality. I could tell her that the only way to survive the draft you're currently trapped in is to stop trying to rewrite the past and start dealing with the splinters right in front of you. I stood there in the cold, dusty air for a long time. I listened to the distant, muffled sound of a siren wailing a few blocks over, cutting through the winter morning. I smelled the pine. I felt the ache in my lower back from leaning over the workbench. Then I tapped the trash can icon. Delete. The message vanished. The screen refreshed, showing an empty inbox. I didn't owe Rowan my anger, and I certainly didn't owe her my absolution. She wanted me to anchor her. She wanted me to respond so she could prove to herself that she still existed in relation to me. But I refused to carry her ghost anymore. Her tragedy was her own luggage. She had to drag it herself. I locked the phone screen. I set the device face down on a pile of shop towels, deliberately pushing it to the far corner of the workbench. I picked up a piece of 120 grit sandpaper. I wrapped it tightly around a rectangular rubber block, my fingers gripping it until my knuckles went white. I walked back to the bookshelf, placed my hands on the rough, unsanded edge of the top panel, and pressed down. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was loud, harsh, and perfectly rhythmic. Fine wood dust drifted up into the air, catching the pale, watery sunlight bleeding through the dirty garage window. The muscles in my forearms burned a dull, repetitive ache that let me know I was alive. I wasn't a reborn genius. I wasn't a corporate martyr. I wasn't the victim of a time-traveling thief. I was just Naomi. I was 32 years old. I worked 40 hours a week, tracking freight trucks. I drank cheap beer on Thursdays. And I built things that were meant to hold weight, one flawed physical piece at a time. I leaned heavily into the sandpaper, letting the rough, repetitive friction clear my mind completely. The timeline wasn't broken. It was just moving forward, exactly as messy and unedited as it was always meant to be. And for the first time in a very long time, I was finally keeping pace.